welcome back to our lecture here on the geography and early culture of Greece. In part one, we talked about the geography. We talked about how they are surrounded by water and they were separated politically because of the terrain and the mountains. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to a little bit more of their culture here. But kind of right where we left off, we were talking about the early cultures that influenced the Greeks. We had talked about the Mycenaeans, and we'd also talked about the Phoenicians. So we've got one more group that we need to talk about. Actually, there's a second group we need to talk about, but we need to look at specifically the Mycenaeans and how they also influenced the Greeks. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the Greeks themselves and their culture. So let's move forward. So the third group is the Mycenaeans. We had already talked about the Minoans who lived down here on the island of Crete. We talked about the Phoenicians that lived way out east on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. But here we're going to talk about the Mycenaeans that lived in Mycenae, which is actually right here. They controlled areas in this region on the Peloponnesus part of Greece. So let's look at that. So the Mycenaeans mostly are famous for fighting the Trojans in the Trojan Wars. Now we're going to study this. It's actually something that many historians believe is more mythology than reality, although some believe that an actual battle did take place at the city of Troy. But Homer writes this in the Iliad, and this is definitely going to be a big learning outcome for us in our unit here. So we're going to look at the Mycenaeans, but they actually did exist in Mycenae. You can see the citadel here. This was also an engineering and empire that we watched at the beginning of the unit. I've had the luxury of being able to see the citadel here in the Lion's Gate. So that's me on the left and my wife and I on the right underneath the Lion's Gate. It's really pretty impressive. It's gigantic. So here is a video of me just inside. So you can take a look. There it is. You can see the mountains in the background. Really kind of gorgeous view up on this hill by the Lion's Gate. Alright, moving on. Nearby is Agamemnon's tomb. Agamemnon's a name you'll get very familiar with when we get into the Iliad and the story of the Trojan Wars. And so this was also an engineering and empire. So you got to go inside of it. It's called the Beehive. So just another, whoops, my video not going to play. There we go. See me inside of it. There are actually quite a few bees inside, surprisingly. Sort of fitting. And again, for those of you who are not interested in seeing pictures or videos of my trip, you can certainly skip forward. All right. So the last group that we need to talk about is the Dorians. Now, you can see here in the green section, this is where the Dorians were located. And honestly, the Dorians, there's not a lot known about them. They're considered as the, really kind of considered to be the Dark Ages of Greek history. Dark Ages is a theme that we see in history when not much is innovated or created or written down. So they were the group that controlled parts of Greece right before the flourishing of the Greek culture that we're going to talk about next. So not much is known about them. All right, Greek culture. So we've talked about their geography. We've talked about the groups that influenced them. Let's talk about the Greeks. So due to the warm climate, the Greeks enjoyed and participated in outdoor activities. There's no doubt that they were outdoorsy people, and the Olympic Games are a direct result of that. Due to the terrain, the Greeks created city-states. That's one of our vocab words. We've heard that term before. A city-state is a city that operates much like independent countries do. So imagine all the cities around you currently, each having their own government, each having their own military, and being separate from one another. Yeah, you might speak the same language, might even worship some of the same gods, but you're separate from one another. That's how a city-state operates. So due to city-states, the Greeks were a civilization. They met all 5 characteristics, but they were never a unified empire. We never have one ruler who rules all over Greece. Again, each of these city-states ruled themselves, and there was never one ruler that controlled all of them. So the Greeks shared similarities in culture, but their politics and military differed by city. I mean, some cities were democracy, like Athens. Others were an oligarchy or a monarchy. And we're going to use those terms a little bit later in the unit to kind of understand the difference between some of these city-states. So they were all Greek, but they controlled themselves, each city. So again, outdoorsy, athletic, that leads to the Olympic Games. The Olympics started in the city of Olympia, which is on the Peloponnesus as well, on the west side. This was the hotel we stayed in. It's a really kind of cool little city, because this was pretty much the one end of the city, and it's maybe about a half a mile stretch of just shopping. And it's clean. The people were very friendly. There's a couple ice cream shops on there, a couple of pizza places. It was a really nice little town. But just outside of this town, within walking distance, is the ancient site of the first Olympic Games. This is the Olympic Stadium where the very first Olympic Games were held. There's not a lot left there, as you can see, but they did have a starting line embedded in the gravel there, and so I did run a little bit, and so I can say I ran in the original Olympic Stadium, which is really kind of cool. Here's just another look at that. You can see those people standing down there on the starting line. This is just another view of it, worth taking a look. You can imagine each of the sides of this would have been filled with seating and would have had a lot of people there to witness the games. This is all the chaperones from our trip to Greece at one of the main places. This would have been one of the main gathering places in Olympia for the Olympic Games. Now, the Olympic Games were revived in Athens in 1896. We're used to seeing the Olympics every 4 years, but that wasn't a thing again until 1896. So we got to visit the new Olympic Stadium that was rebuilt in 1896 and held the revived games. So that was pretty cool as well. Here's another one of my little selfie videos. Check it out. We did not get to go inside the stadium, unfortunately, but we did get to take some pictures right out in front of it. Again, we talked about Greek city-states. There are many different ones. Athens and Sparta tend to be the most well-known, but there's Megara, Corinth, Argos, many, many other city-states. Now, back to the culture of the Greeks. So Greek epics or narrative poems celebrated heroic deeds and characters. And two of the best known come from Homer. So Homer wrote the Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan Wars, and the Odyssey. And we're going to study both of those in this unit. Some very famous characters, some very famous plot lines come out of both of those books. And those books have been studied for really and read for thousands of years. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey moving forward in this unit. Now, Greek mythology is a big part of the Greeks as well, the Greek gods, and we're going to talk about them in the next day or two. So we've got a quick look here at some of the religion of the Greeks. Lots of different gods and goddesses. They're definitely polytheistic. Oftentimes these are very interesting for students, as they all have different stories, and they quarrel, they fight, they love, they kind of, all their lives are intermingled with each other. So we're going to see this family tree here in a little bit further into our unit. It was believed that the gods lived on top of Mount Olympus. So the reason I'm bringing that up here is, of course, to show off a little bit more of my trip. We did travel north to Mount Olympus, as you can see on this map, and we did stop and take some pictures, so you can see Mount Olympus both in the background of both of these pictures, but we ended up having lunch on top of Mount Olympus, and actually that's misleading. It's not on top. It's on the side of the mountain. It's about as high up as you could go. This was the view, and I can tell you definitively, this does not do it justice. It looks so much cooler in person. But we had lunch at this little restaurant here on Mount Olympus. So I got some chicken souvlaki, which is just chicken on a skewer essentially, and we ordered saganaki, which is fried cheese. You can see that on the right. It was really salty, but fried cheese is usually pretty good. All right, one of the things we had mentioned earlier is that the Greeks lived around the sea, and because of that, they became master shipbuilders. And just like you saw in Engineering and Empire, they built triremes. Triremes were very sturdy ships with a battering ram in front, and they could attack like a missile. So this is one thing the Greeks are really well known for, and the Athenians are going to be very exceptional at sea with their navy. Architecture is a big part of the Greek culture as well. The Parthenon here says, where do you see similar structures today? I mean, there's a lot of buildings, especially in Washington, D.C., that are modeled after the Greek columns and the Greek style. So just something to think about there, the influence of the Greeks. The Greeks would pioneer democracy, philosophy, warfare, and architecture. Those would be major parts of their culture. And the Greeks really considered themselves to be part of the Hellenic world. I don't know that they would have referred to themselves as Greek necessarily, but it was part of this Hellenic world that we now call Classical Greece. And that brings us to the end, folks. In this lecture video, we have covered the geography of Greece. We've covered the cultures that influenced the Greeks, and then we just talked about Greek culture, as well as seeing some of the videos and pictures from my trip. So the Greeks were products of their geography. There's no doubt. They were shaped by the land and the water, and they never united into an empire, but instead had city-states and created a culture that would help define Western civilization. So really, truly remarkable people. If we come back to our constructive response question here, it says, identify ways the geography of Greece helped shape Greek culture. We know they were shipbuilders because they lived on the water. We know they were outdoorsy people because they had good weather. We know that they were separated politically from one another and therefore never had a unified empire. Instead, they had city-states. So those are just some of the examples of the way the geography shaped who they are. That's going to do it for us here today. I hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.